So he decides he's going to break the law. And he's going to launch an information war.
But how do you inform the masses without newspapers in those days?
So this is his genius. He delivers copies to local, provincial journalists around the country. They're not as tightly monitored by the censors. And equally, he gets hold of the moral leaders of the Swiss church, theologians like Karl Barth and Paul Vogt. And on one day, in late June 44, he dropped this information bomb. And the federal censors are completely blindsided.
Welcome to History for the Curious, the most listened to Jewish history podcast in the world, powered by Olami UK in London. I'm Mena Reisner, and I host internationally renowned historian Rabbi Aubrey Hirsch. Join hundreds of thousands of curious listeners as we travel through 2,000 years of Jewish history, through triumph and tragedy, exile and survival, faith and resilience, uncovering the people, events and turning points that created the Jewish journey and continue to shape us into who we are today.
This week's podcast has been dedicated by the Hartmann family, proud sponsors of this episode relating to Hungarian Jewry during World War II. It is Le'ilu Nishmas Tibor and Sarah Hartmann, Nasanel ben Shmuel Mordechai and Sarah Bas Moshe Yosef. And just one story which I was told this week. Bob Hartmann's mother and grandmother were both transported from Deportation to Auschwitz in 1944. His mother was 17, his grandmother 41, and they came face to face with Mengele during the selection on arrival. Mengele pointed to the right for his mother, but to the left for his grandmother. His mother appealed to Mengele. "My mother is young, she can still work." And Mengele paused. He looked again, and he motioned them both to the right. She saved her mother's life, and both would survive the war and live in Canada afterwards.
Oh, it's an incredible story. Generally, did people know when coming to Auschwitz what right and left meant?
Hungarian Jews generally did not. She must have intuited.
Wow. And talking of Poland, you have been there twice in recent weeks.
Yes. We need various shout-outs. One, obviously, to Menorah High Year 13, who've recently returned, and then to the Jewish grammar boys from Manchester who helped me make minyanim in Poland, and especially to those who turned up at the very beginning of Shacharis.
So shout out to Jewish Grammar and Menorah High. And for all those clever enough to have joined our WhatsApp group, they would have seen some behind-the-scenes footage from your trip. The thing that stood out to me was what you found in Rudolf Hirsch's house, the uniform, but with the barbed wire belt. So it was very moving. And speaking of the WhatsApp group, if you haven't joined, you should join now. We've just reached 800 people on it. In fact, so many people joined when they heard it that WhatsApp thought it might be bots, and then we had to reset the group link. And thank you for your emails. We put the new one in the description. And if it happens again and you try and join, then just email us and we'll reset it again. Thank you for all those who joined, and we've also allowed the permissions that you can add your friends and family too. So we are continuing our 3 weeks Holocaust series. This is the episode before our Tisha B'Av episode. In this episode, we're going to be discussing one of the unknown heroes of the Holocaust. Generally, when we think of the heroes who stood up during the Holocaust, there's certain names who stand out. They're household names. But as you do, Rabbi Hirsch, you found an unknown hero.
Indeed. And we will also look at a German family and how it diverged from the norm. So this is about a Jew called George Mantello. And one of the biggest war victories came from an office in Geneva, Switzerland. But as you said, most of you have probably never heard of him. It's not just that his personality shunned the limelight, but for decades his story was buried. Layers of censorship, diplomatic embarrassment, academic controversy. But it is a fascinating story of intrigue, drama, tragedy and success. He was born in 1891 into a textile manufacturing family in Transylvania and became a very successful financier and manufacturer in Bucharest before the war. And in the course of this, he met and befriended the Salvadorian consul Castellanos. and he used his connections to buy goods for El Salvador at a competitive rate. And in 1939, Castellanos appointed Mantello El Salvador's honorary consul for Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, and Romania.
What sort of position was that? It had authority?
No, it's really an honorific title. It probably didn't mean that much back then, but of course the war would change everything. In 1941, he decides to liquidate his assets in Romania. He moves to Switzerland, or he wanted to move to Switzerland. He left his factories to be run by his partners and turned everything else into cash, 140 million lei. And with this, he bought 60 train carloads of cotton and shipped them off to Switzerland, sold them there at a profit. So while he was settling his affairs in Romania, the United States entered World War II. This is December 1941. Now, El Salvador, which is a Southern American country, together with most of the other countries there, declared themselves to be sort of part of the Allied powers. But what therefore happens is they've broken off formal diplomatic relationships with the Axis, with Germany and Italy, etc. And that included Romania. So Mantello now gets hold of a proper Salvadorian passport. He gets an official appointment as first secretary to the Salvadorian consulate in Geneva. He doesn't speak a word of Spanish. He had never set foot in Central America. He had no training in, international law. But on paper, he's now an official representative of a Latin American country and carrying a diplomatic passport that gives him immunity. And Switzerland took over the protection of most of these South American consuls so that Mantello comes under this type of protection. Now, there is a sort of a law, if you want to put it that way, that diplomats of hostile countries are allowed to leave the country in which they are in to travel home safely. So he gets on the train from Bucharest. He's accompanied by a number of other Latin American diplomats, and they're going to Switzerland. But at the Swiss-Italian border, 2 Nazi guards suspected him of being George Mandel, who was a French Jewish minister, and they order him off the train. And one of the Nazis points to a suitcase above his head and says, "Take your suitcase." It actually belonged to the wife of one of the Swiss diplomats, but Mantello knew she wouldn't say anything, so he takes it. And the 2 Nazis bring him to the Gestapo office in Zagreb. And they order him to open the suitcase. And he says, "I can't. I don't have the key." "Why not?" "Because it's not my suitcase." "So why did you bring it?" "Because you told me to." So the Nazis force open the suitcase. And they see that it's filled with women's clothing. One of them was so angry, he picked up a chair and he slammed Mantello across the face, breaking 2 teeth and part of his jaw, which was actually an injury that he suffered from for many years. And Mantello responds by punching the Nazi in the face. And years later he commented, "I don't know how I managed to do that. The audacity to hit a Gestapo officer, I could have been shot."
Why wasn't he?
Well, he is a diplomat. He is protected by his diplomatic status, at least to a large degree. He is brought to Edmund Wiesenmeyer, who is a major general in the SS, attached to the German delegation in Zagreb, and Wiesenmeyer would later become Hitler's minister in charge of Hungary, as well as obviously a collaborator with Eichmann in the final solution. But Mantello is fearless, basically. He tells Wiesenmeyer, "The Salvador government is keeping an eye on my whereabouts. If you make any problems, I assure you the government will stop Germans from leaving El Salvador. And if I'm harmed in any way, the Swiss consul will find out about it." So Wiesenmeyer puts him under house arrest. He's under the constant surveillance of the Ustasha, which is the Croatian Nazi police, and he lives there in that way for the next 3-4 months. And the next move, which is pretty unbelievable. One day, Mantello is visited by one of his Romanian business partners, an Andrew, who proposes a dangerous scheme to get out of here. A pilot would travel from Milan to Bucharest with a stopover in Zagreb. And Mantello would escape from the hotel disguised as this guy's co-pilot.
But how would he get to Switzerland from Bucharest?
Okay, yep, that was still to be done, but, he's...
One stage at a time.
Exactly. So Mantello agrees, and this pilot turns up. He's being very well paid. He visited him in the hotel with a co-pilot's uniform that he smuggled in. Mantello puts on the uniform. They both leave the hotel together. They arrive at the airport, and Ustasha soldiers approach them. They thought he was the pilot, and they said to him, "Where's Mantello?" because they had discovered that he'd escaped. And Mantello sort of coolly points to two young Volksdeutscher who were standing nearby, and the Ustasha go up to the young men to arrest them, and a fist fight breaks out. And in the meantime, Mantello and the pilot, they get out of there, and ended up flying to Budapest. But, as you said, he's still got to get across Romania, and he's got to enter Switzerland incognito. Here comes another one of his business partners, Captain Vasilescu, who was the Romanian military attaché, and his brother-in-law was the head of Romania's secret police. So Mantello goes to see them, and they came to an arrangement. They came up with a plan. He is going to put on a Romanian army officer's uniform, get on a train with his false papers, travel first class, while the head of the secret police and this guy's brother-in-law are going to travel second class. And on the way, they are going via Budapest. And Mantello wanted to get off the train there to see his wife, his son, and his in-laws. But he is ordered that he cannot get off the train. So at the station, his family walked onto the platform, and all they could do was wave to each other. He arrives in Switzerland, and he's now determined to make his diplomatic status count, because the German bureaucracy, for all of its genocidal intent, is still obsessed with rules and legality. And therefore, when they see Jews with passports of countries they don't know, it's going to make them hesitate to deport them.
Wasn't El Salvador by now with the Allies?
Well, yes, but it's sort of. Meaning Latin American countries were still valuable to the Germans because they wanted to maintain diplomatic channels. And also, these countries hadn't yet made a full declaration of war. They never sent any soldiers into the battlefield. So now what he does is he uses his own money to fund an operation, and he begins mass-producing Salvadorian citizenship certificates.
They could be used as passports?
Well, they weren't what you might call a standard passport. They were certificates, but they're typed up on notehead paper, and he makes it look very official. There's elaborate stamps and official seals, and back then not everyone had a passport anyway, and it's enough to make German or Hungarian officials pause. He even has to backdate some of them, because the Nazis had announced that changes of citizenship after a certain date wouldn't count. And each document, it's not only an individual who can use it, but an entire family. And therefore, it increases the amount of people who can be saved. He then uses the black market to smuggle basically stacks of these blank certificates, because he didn't write any names on these documents, and he smuggles them into the Jewish ghettos. There are therefore thousands of people who should have been loaded onto cattle trucks. Instead, they're being pulled out of line and placed in internment camps for foreign nationals, like Vittel. It isn't freedom, they're still prisoners, but they're alive, and basically the papers bought them time. And he doesn't take 1 penny for this, by the way. Now, it's temporary, but it kept people alive for 2 years, and as a result, many would survive the war. But by 1944, the Nazis were prepared to disregard all these rules. Eichmann had one final objective, the complete annihilation of Hungarian Jewry, which was the last intact and large Jewish population which remained in Europe. And given the expanded borders of what Hungary was during World War II, this is now 750,000 Jews. On March 19th, 1944, just after Purim, Germany takes direct control over the Jewish problem in Hungary, and very rapidly the Jews are placed in ghettos, and the adjustment was sudden and it was radical.
Right, the speed that things were changing, we actually mentioned, and if the listeners remember, one of the Holocaust survivors we interviewed last year told us that she was still having a dress tailored for Pesach, completely unaware that within 7 weeks she would have by then lost many members of her family and find herself fighting to survive each day in Auschwitz. And that was, life was normal till then.
Yes, it was a complete turnaround, unexpected and brutal. Now, Mantello was aware that the Jews were being targeted, but he doesn't have clear information, how many, what the plans are. And in order to get this authentic information, he realizes that the only way he can do this, he's got to send somebody directly into Hungary, somebody who obviously would be allowed in and out. And he convinces a longtime friend, another business associate, a non-Jew, called Florian Manoliu, the commercial attaché at the Romanian consulate in Bern, to travel to Hungary. And Mantello provided him with 1,000 stamped Salvadorian citizen papers, a large sum of money, and medication. And the first stop on this mission was to be Bistrica, because this was Mantello's hometown, where his parents and the extended family lived among the city's 8,000 Jews. And a few months earlier, Mantello had provided his wife, who was stuck there, with a regular passport from El Salvador, but it had now expired, and Manoliu was bringing her an updated one. And he also told him to meet with Moshe Kraus, who was the head of what was called the Palestine Certificate Office in Budapest. There's a delay of several weeks because the German embassy in Bern were aware of this Manoliu's anti-Nazi leanings, and they're suspicious. Why does he want to go to Hungary? So they allowed him into the country, but they don't allow him to get off in Budapest. On May 22nd, he leaves. In Vienna, he arranged for the Romanian consul to meet him and take his diplomatic pouch, because this contains all the money, the medicine, the papers, and this way it will be sent on into Hungary without anybody checking it. In Hungary, Manoliu travels to various towns, Satu Mare, Dej, and in all of them, he comes across the same ominous story. These towns are Judenrein. And tragically, this included Mantello's hometown. All his family had been deported. He decides to carry on to Budapest, even though he's contravening the Nazi orders and he's putting himself in danger, and he arrives on June 18th. He meets up with Karl Lutz, the Swiss consul. He's one of the Chasidei Umas Ha'olam, one of the righteous Gentiles who saved many Jews in Budapest in the last few months of the war. And Lutz takes Manoliu to Kraus's hideout. Now, when they first meet, Kraus is hesitant to talk. This guy is a non-Jew. He doesn't know. Maybe he's part of a Gestapo trap to find out how much the Jews know about the final solution. But he hands him a business card with a Hebrew message on it. And at that stage, Kraus feels secure. And he hands over to him a frightening, scarcely believable report. It was the Auschwitz protocols, and it contained eyewitness testimony from the first 2 Jews who'd escaped Birkenau in April 1944, Werber Rosenberg and Wretzler, who, after a hazardous 10-day flight, managed to cross the border from Poland into Slovakia and got into contact with the Jewish underground, their so-called working group.
And that included Rev. Michael Weissmandel.
Yes, he was one of the heads of that group. And these 2 escapees report in gruesome detail their experiences in Auschwitz-Birkenau. And the report also linked to more evidence from 2 other escapees in May 1944, and the picture drawn is not just that mass murder is going on, but it's at a rate unparalleled in human history, before or since. And Reinhard Weissmandel had added to the report a plea that the Allies bomb the railway lines. And Kraus adds a personal letter which should be publicised from a Jew living in Budapest, in Hungary. And he gives him another document called the Hungarian Report, how they got hold of it, stole it from the Hungarian government, bribed somebody for it, because it was the series of ghettos and deportations of Hungarian Jewry, region by region, and 400,000 Jews are being documented there. And once again, the speed that it had been carried out at meant that one kahila couldn't warn the next one. It took the Jews by complete surprise. And Manoliu returns to Switzerland. He's exhausted by the journey, but much more so by the news. And at 11 p.m. on Tuesday evening, June 20th, the phone rings in Mantello's hotel suite in Geneva, where he is staying with his brother. 4 weeks had passed since he'd set out on this mission. And he says to Mantello, "I've just arrived at the border. I have some very bad news. I'll see you as soon as I get to Geneva." And Mantello understood that he's, reluctant to speak on the phone because there is monitoring by the Swiss censorship police. Manoliu arrived at 2 o'clock in the morning, and he tells the two brothers everything that he's learnt. He describes the immensity of the tragedy, from Sopron in the west through Debrecen and Munkac to Kluisenberg and beyond in the east. Nowadays, it is Romania. And he also told the brothers of their personal loss, that more than 200 members of their family had been deported. Manoliu leaves the apartment, and the two brothers tore their lapels for courier, and they sit shiver. But a half an hour in, Mantello and his brother say, "We've got to do something about this."
How many Jews are left in Hungary at this point?
About 250,000. 437,000 were deported in 7 weeks, and 80% of them were murdered on arrival. But here, in and around Budapest, there are about 250,000 left.
Why was Hungary so hard hit relative to the other European countries?
It wasn't. There were 3.25 million Jews in Poland before the war. 3 million of them would be murdered. There were 140,000 Jews in Holland before the war. 80% of them would be murdered. What happened in Hungary, which makes it different, is the speed. The fact that they're now at their apex of murder and all of the experience, so to speak, that the Nazis got on the job, and the fact that Birkenau now had 4 fully running crematoria and gas chambers, which were larger than anything that had existed beforehand. All of that is what makes it such a tragedy, that by 1944, when the Allies are clearly winning the war, the turnaround for Hungarian Jewry, who assumed that they'd survive, just didn't materialize.
I heard recently, I can't remember if it was Holland or Hungary, that the speed was due to the fact that the government actually knew who was Jewish and where they were. As part of the census, you had to say religion even prior to the war. Have you heard that?
That was pretty much the case in most countries in Europe, that your religion was known either literally on your passport or just in the census or other such information gathering. But it was actually in Hungary in particular. Eichmann came in with a few hundred members of the SS. This was done by the Hungarians. That's what made it so fast. And unlike further east, where it had taken place in 41, 42, and it had been mass graves, where you had to bring village by village and town by town, here they brought everybody into a ghetto and just put them on the trains and brought them to Auschwitz at a rate of 5,000 to 10,000 every day.
So you needed local government help.
Yes, absolutely. And Mantello is now transformed into a demon that wouldn't let him rest. His time in Switzerland until now, he'd been there for 2 years, he'd established relationships with diplomats within religious and social circles. He'd even befriended Hungarian students by subsidizing some of them and by financing their club, which consisted primarily of non-Jewish Hungarian sons of émigrés and nobility who'd left Hungary during the short-lived communist revolution in 1919 and fled to Switzerland, or they'd sent their sons to Switzerland for education, and he now has links to these students. So he gets them to turn up. The first students show up very early Wednesday morning, and they are given the job of providing a German language version of the two reports and of the letters. And to double-check, to assure efficiency, Mantello divided the group into 3 pairs, each of which translated several pages and then gave it to another group to check, because they need to make sure that this is being given in its absolute accuracy. And Mantello himself starts looking around for what was at the time called a Gestetner mimeograph machine, a sort of photocopier, to run off 50 copies. And it takes a day to complete the English, French, and Spanish versions. But to make Krauss's letter more effective, Mantello made a couple of important changes, because Krauss ended his letter on the despairing note, noting how many tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands had already been murdered. Mantello added a couple of lines to encourage rescue. And his paragraph ended with the assurance that help is still possible. And there are people willing and able to give it, but we've got to get the report out there. On Thursday morning, this is now June 21st, he joins the members of the Swiss Rabbis Committee and the Swiss Hungarian Committee for an emergency meeting in Zurich to inform them of this news. The meeting lasts all day, long past midnight. There are a dozen people there listening in silence. And finally, Rabbi Kornfein gets up and he says, his tears streaming down his face, this is like Churban Bayis Sheni. This is the destruction of the temple. We have to sit shiva. And he tears his jacket and everybody there performs kriya.
What did they know before hearing this? Did they know anything?
They knew that Jews were being murdered in Eastern Europe because Switzerland being a neutral country, things came through and telegrams were sent, etc.
They just had no idea of the scale.
And of the speed with which it was happening. And that every day was critical. Now, there's one member of this committee, a non-Jew, a guy called Palai, who doesn't believe it. And he stands up and he said, this is just Romanian propaganda, because there's always been rivalry between the Hungarians and Romanians. And Mantello, very angry, and he says, throw this guy out. I don't ever to see him again. We have too much at stake to listen to fools like him. And he then sort of issues a series of commands. He tells Rabbi Kornfein to get hold of Pastor Vogt in order to get the backing of the church in Switzerland. He tells Michael Banyai to take a copy to the American representative of the War Refugee Board, the sort of the joint, and he said he was going to go and see Commodore Freddie West of British intelligence.
So he was supposed to alert the Americans, get the Americans involved.
Right. He was going to take it to McClelland, but this McClelland did basically almost nothing. And when he finally did respond, it was sort of pretty much condescending that you've tried your bit and you probably feel you've done everything you can. In fact, it wasn't until June the 24th, and remember, every day is critical, that McClelland wrote to Washington about Auschwitz. And when he did, he wrote that this is being submitted to me, but I can't venture any opinion on whether it's going to work or not. So, back to Mantello. The intelligence agencies in Britain and America knew the truth. They'd known it for a while, and just like we mentioned last week about the papers. But Mantello knew that he faced a wall because the Swiss had strict wartime censorship laws, and they are terrified of anything that might compromise their neutrality, so they explicitly forbade the publication of atrocity reports or material that would inflame public opinion against Nazi Germany. Which means, if Mantello follows the rules, if he goes to the editors of the big national newspapers in Bern or Zurich, the censors would intercept the report, confiscate it, and silence him before he could print a single word. So he decides he's going to break the law, and he's going to launch an information war.
But how do you inform the masses without newspapers in those days?
So this is his genius. He delivers copies to local, provincial journalists around the country. They're not as tightly monitored by the censors, and equally, he gets hold of the moral leaders of the Swiss church, theologians like Karl Barth and Paul Vogt. And on one day, in late June 44, he dropped this information bomb. And the federal censors are completely blindsided. There is an unprecedented media avalanche which consumes the country. 400 articles across more than 120 Swiss newspapers. And the papers didn't mince words. They didn't hide the story on page 10. They used words like Massenmord, mass murder, and Vernichtungslager, extermination camp. And priests read Mantello's summary to their congregation. And he had basically taken the Holocaust out of the shadows and put it squarely on the front page. And we're talking about newspapers across the entire spectrum. You've got conservative Catholic journals, you've got secular liberal dailies, you've got left-wing socialist papers. They're all printing the exact same horrifying details.
Well, this is in complete contrast to what we discussed last week, which was taking place in America.
Absolutely.
But in America, they were targeting the big newspapers, which wouldn't have worked in Switzerland as well.
Yeah.
Why didn't they also do the same thing and target the smaller ones around the country?
You have to realize it's not because of censorship that the American papers weren't printing. And clearly they had a far larger readership. If you want to get the news out, that's where it's got to go. And it's not as if the American papers never spoke about the Holocaust, but as we said, they placed it on page 13, or they placed it in the middle of paragraphs dealing with other things. They didn't have to run the gauntlet of a censor. That wasn't the issue there. And therefore the way to get it out is to get to the big boys. That's how you're going to get maximal information. Now, the Swiss authorities bring Mantello in, and he says to them, okay, go ahead, you can arrest me, but if you do, you're going to have to explain to thousands of Swiss citizens who are now protesting in the streets why you're locking up the diplomat who exposed the death camps, and you're doing this to protect Nazi secrets. And the Swiss blinked first. But Mantello understands that this Swiss publicity is only the first step. This has got to reach the Allied powers with enough force to create a political and military ultimatum. And this is where he has another person whom he had a relationship with, a guy called Walter Garrett, who's the director of the British Exchange Telegraph, of the newspapers. Garrett knew Mantello, he admired him, but at first he's still reluctant to accept the authenticity of the reports. I mean, to us nowadays, we know about it, but you're reading this in the middle of nowhere. It's too impossible almost to believe. So he calls Commodore West, who's the British intelligence officer, and says, Mantello's a good guy, but is he reliable? And West says to him, let me tell you something about Mantello. I was once looking for a way to send thousands of valuable Swiss chronographs, precision watches, to England for use by our pilots in the war. It's not a simple matter. The equipment was worth millions and hard to obtain. Mantello smuggled it out in his Salvadorian diplomatic pouch, and he took care of everything. And anybody else in this situation would have taken full advantage, would have gotten a lot of money out of it. Mantello didn't ask for a shilling. And so he sends it. And the news is now in England, in America. It's being sent to the Pope, to ambassadors around the world.
Yeah, but people in those positions of power knew this all.
But it's coming from sources which are public, so they can't deny knowledge. They've got to act on it, something. They have to do something. And it produced results. The Allies sent radio transmissions into Hungary naming specific Hungarian politicians and officials involved in the deportations, because, of course, the Hungarians thought they were anonymous and that they're protected, and now their names are being read out on broadcasts. And the Pope breaks his long silence, and he takes what for him was the unprecedented step of sending an open telegram directly to the Royal Palace in Budapest, directly to the leader, Horthy, in Hungary. And Horthy is now under siege. He's an anti-Semite. He'd stripped Hungarian Jews of their rights. He'd overseen the deportation, but he believed he could let Eichmann do his dirty work. But because of Mantel-Mantello, the world is now reacting. Roosevelt was threatening retribution. The King of Sweden wrote to him. And British bombers were appearing over Budapest, dropping bombs as a warning. So on July 7th, 1944, Horthy convenes the Hungarian Privy Council, and overriding the furious protests of his own pro-Nazi ministers, and of course in direct defiance of Adolf Eichmann, Horthy issued an order for the immediate halt to all trains leaving Hungary for Auschwitz.
Wow, and this is only a month after the media storm.
Absolutely. Even less. It is 2 weeks. And in a remarkable policy reversal, Horthy now looks for ways to protect the Jews and even made an offer to allow the exit of 10,000 Jewish children. Unfortunately, it was never seriously taken up by the Allies. But this life or death chess game is not over yet, because the SS are not giving up. So the first thing Eichmann does is he decides to test Horthy's resolve through deception. On July the 19th, the SS units moved on to the Kistarsksa internment camp just outside Budapest. They rounded up over 1,500 Jewish inmates and loaded them onto a train bound for Auschwitz. And what he had done is he'd brought all the sort of main Jewish leaders of Budapest to his headquarters for an emergency meeting. And as soon as they're in the building, he ordered his officers to detain them and cut off their phone lines and not allow anyone to leave. And he figures out that by the time the meeting ends, the train would be across the border and out of Hungarian jurisdiction. But word of this illegal transport leaked out of the camp through a sympathetic railway worker. We don't know who he is, but he's definitely part of the Hasidic Umas Ha'olam, and it reaches the royal palace. Horthy found out that Eichmann had openly defied his order on his own soil, and he is furious. Because this isn't just about the Jews anymore. This is about his own authority and ultimately about his own survival after the war. So he ordered a regiment of Hungarian regular army to surround the transport train, and the SS backed down. The train is forced to return to Budapest. Its 1,500 passengers are returned to the ghetto that they'd been in. Now, more attempts by the SS would follow, but July was a month of respite, basically.
What about Wallenberg?
Yes, okay. So July is equally where the names we are familiar with step in. Raoul Wallenberg, the Swedish diplomat, arrives in Budapest on July 9th, 1944. This is, by the way, 2 days after Horthy issued the mandate halting the trains, which is why it's not Wallenberg that made it happen. Wallenberg comes to very much help out at a time of absolute hashkacha. He came at the perfect time, because now Swedish papers, Portuguese papers start appearing in Budapest. And in fact, Mantello in his Geneva office turns the El Salvador consulate into an assembly line of papers, because now that you've got Horthy's government terrified of the Allies, Hungarian officials are beginning to honour these foreign protective documents that they would have thrown in the garbage weeks earlier. A piece of paper with a Latin American seal on it is suddenly as valuable as gold. And you now have an international ghetto. Most people know of the ghetto in what is nowadays the main Jewish area in Budapest, but there was an international ghetto near the parliament, which housed 15,000 people with these international documents and passports. And there's the glass house nearby there, which was a sanctuary for 3,000 Jews. As I said, it's not over, because the SS are too determined to murder the Jews to allow this to continue. In October, Horthy was overthrown and replaced by a fascist Hungarian government, the Arrow Cross.
This is very late in the war. Like, they can't return trains to Auschwitz by this point.
Yes. It's not only that it's late in the war, it's the fact that in December, the gas chambers would actually be dismantled in Birkenau and they'd be destroyed in January. So they're not shipping them there. This few months of break saved Budapest Jewry from being transported to Birkenau. So what do? The Arrow Cross resorted to shooting thousands of Jews into the Danube. And the Nazis would send over 40,000 Jews on death marches towards Austria. But Out of 250,000 Jews, 110,000 survived. This is the only city in occupied Europe with tens of thousands of Jews in January 45. The stopping of the trains prevented Budapest from going the way of the rest of Hungary. And now, with the war coming to an end, Mantello turns from rescue to relief. There was a group, famously of 1,300 Jews from the Kastner train, sent from Budapest to Bergen-Belsen. They were supposed to be sent to Switzerland, but Eichmann turned the trains otherwise. And they're only freed in December 44. And this group includes the Satmar Rebbe. Now, the Mantello family had a connection to the Rebbe going back 3 generations, and Mantello financed and arranged for a villa in Geneva to house him when he arrived. He also extended financial support to Rabbi Yonasan Steif, the head of the Bezdin in Budapest, and Rabbi Eli Munk from Paris, the mother of Lady Jacobowitz. He escaped over the French-Swiss border with his wife and his 6 children. Mantello steps in to get their release from a civilian refugee camp, and he personally arranges for a chicken to be delivered to their home every Friday until France was liberated and they could return to Paris. And then post-war, the famous Skulana Rebbe needed immediate funding to rescue orphan children from Transnistria. To smuggle them out of communist Romania in 1948, Mantello provided $15,000.
How did you have access to so much money?
He was a very wealthy guy. He'd been wealthy before the war, and he used it. He used it for this purpose. He saw no other purpose to it, basically. This is really seeing things for what they are and the value that they hold. And he has a large post-war rescue operation which came through the ingenuity of Dr. Yakov Griffel, who was the representative of the Vardhat Sola in Turkey. He wanted to move tens of thousands of Holocaust survivors who'd been in Siberia into the West, which was safer, or into Eretz Yisrael. And he heard that Mantello still had 1,000 copies of Salvadorian citizenship papers, so he asked him swap the photos, and each document, as we said earlier, applies to an entire family. You're talking 5,000-6,000 individuals who can be saved that way. And Mantello's final major rescue act involved a non-Jew, Monsignor Bela Varga, who was the last legitimate anti-communist president of the Hungarian parliament. He had come to Mantello's attention during the war because he'd provided false identity cards to Polish refugees, to Jews, and this drew severe persecution from the Hungarian fascists. And he was still persona non grata after the war, when they begin arresting democratic Hungarian politicians, and Varga is imprisoned. He actually, in prison, briefly met Raoul Wallenberg, who disappeared. The Soviets arrested him just after liberation in Budapest, and he disappears off the radar. He died in prison. We're not quite sure where or when. And this Varga met him. And Varga then gets into the Russian-occupied zone of Austria, but he's still not free. So Mantello carried out a dangerous operation to get him into Vienna. He has to evade communist agents who are pursuing them. He keeps on changing his car's Swiss license plates. And at one stage, they're staying at a resort near Vienna, and an armed communist assassin bursts into the hotel, demanding Varga, and Mantello attacks him, disarms him, and physically threw him out of the building.
He was quite a personality, and his list of achievements are mind-blowing.
Yep.
He saved tens of thousands of Jews. He made governments aware of what was going on, single-handedly. No team.
Yep.
Just a man on his own.
Yep.
And we've never heard about him. There's no films about him.
Yep. Yeah, he didn't get a victory parade. In fact, his story for decades is actively suppressed, because the Swiss government, I guess, didn't want the world to remember that a refugee had broken their laws to stop a genocide. And the major Allied governments definitely didn't want to be reminded that they'd sat on this the Auschwitz protocol for weeks. So despite the staggering scope of his achievements, public recognition for him was very limited. He received profound expressions of gratitude from individuals, direct beneficiaries, and even from local organizations. In October, the Jewish community of Geneva wrote a letter praising him, noting that he had spent fortunes and risked danger to change the policies of the Hungarian government. And what is very interesting is there's a guy called Andrei Biss, who was a leader of the Budapest Rescue Committee. And he wrote in March 45 that thousands of persecuted individuals owed their survival to the Salvadorian papers and to the worldwide press campaign that Mantello orchestrated in June 44. And Biss adds that Mantello's media strategy basically galvanized global public opinion and directly prompted the Swedish and the Swiss governments to issue protective documentations. So this is a guy who's saying quite clearly what Mantello has done. And then these are overshadowed by malicious rumors. So much so that when Biss himself published a formal historical account of the war, this is in 1966, he completely omitted Mantello's name, any story about the Salvadorian papers, and he even reduced the Swiss newspaper campaign to a generic mention of articles in the Western press. And Kastner, similarly, he marginalizes Mantello's pivotal role in his post-war report, and he said the stopping of the Hungarian deportations was because of the heads of state and the Pope and the international committees.
What was the agenda to minimize his efforts?
Because this would take away the limelight from certain others, and it would expose certain people or organizations as not having done what they should have done.
Right. I mean, if one man can do this, well, why didn't anyone else?
No, more than that, there were those who had sat on the report. It's not that they hadn't done much, and Mantello, in contrast, had done so much. It's that they'd done nothing. And in fact, in the academic world, his reputation was also marginalized. I remember having a conversation with Sir Martin Gilbert, and he, too, got it wrong. I remember we were sitting in his front room, and he dismissed the work of Mantello because he was taken in by the large organizations who removed Mantello from history, and I was sort of taken aback, but I didn't have enough information to hand to argue, and I just let the matter drop. And as we mentioned, there was competitive jealousy amongst the various rescue bodies, which led, unbelievably, to false allegations. They claimed that Mantello was dealing on the black market, that he profited from these papers, and as a result, he was denied post-war, this is, entry visas to England and France. And so once this starts happening, these rumors are now impacting his life. Mantello asked for an official public inquiry into his wartime conduct and finances. Imagine that he has to go to these lengths. And there were subsequent testimonies from multiple diverse high-profile witnesses, and it completely clears Mantello of any wrongdoing, and it exposes the envy of his detractors. Wilhelm Fischer from the World Jewish Congress in Romania confirmed that Romanian Zionist networks cabled thousands of names to Mantello, and Mantello never charged a single dime for the papers. And Dr. Abraham Silberschein testified that while others made massive fortunes selling Latin American documents, he basically disrupted the black market by distributing them entirely free and covered all operational costs out of his own pocket. And then we come back to Walter Garrett, who testifies under oath that his news agency conducted independent, rigorous vetting of Mantello's operation in 43, and he confirmed that there is no financial interest, it was highly effective, and that in 44, the primary catalyst behind the global press campaign that prompted Roosevelt's historic appeal to stop the deportations came from Mantello. And the judicial panel concluded its investigation, this is on June 27th, 1946, and issued a total exoneration. They recognized that Mantello had changed a sort of modest humanitarian project into a massive life-saving apparatus, and it validated the testimony of thousands of survivors who viewed him as exceptionally courageous and selfless.
And the recognition followed after that?
Later, he was probably by then already in his 80s. There was a ceremony in Israel attended by many survivors, and there was one in New York in 1989, in YU, in fact, in 1990 as well. Although probably the most moving moment for Mantello was in 1988. He attended a sort of a major gathering of Holocaust historians in Oxford, and they had prepared a surprise for him because he was brought face to face for the first time with Walter Rosenberg, one of the two men who escaped from Auschwitz in April 1944 and wrote the Auschwitz protocols. And Mantello and Rosenberg had corresponded after the war. They'd never met. And it's, you can imagine, an emotional moment. This is the person who first described the horrors of Auschwitz and challenged the world to do something about them. And he is now embracing the man who had been bold enough to take up the challenge and stop those transports to hell.
Wow.
Now, obviously, without subsequently people on the ground like Wallenberg and Lutz, it might not have gone anywhere. But without Mantello bringing this news to the world, those trains would never have been stopped. So, not just someone unknown, but as incredible as it seems, someone who was denied the truth, never mind the accolades. He wasn't the only one. Controversial events like the Kastner trial and the release of papers from the Jewish Agency and opening of files in Eastern Europe and even files in Yad Vashem would highlight others in the decades to follow. Now, let us move briefly to a German family, the Heydrich family, and the unexpected and divergent members thereof. Reinhard Heydrich was the architect of the final solution until his assassination in 1942. He was the head of the Gestapo and the immediate superior to Adolf Eichmann. He is born on the 7th of March 1904 in Prussia, which, by the way, means he was in his 30s when he oversaw the Holocaust. And his first name reflects the musical interests of his family because his father, Bruno, was a composer who became the founding director of the Halle Conservatory. But Gustav Robert Suess was his grandfather, and Suess was a Jewish-sounding family name, and it would create speculation about Heydrich's non-Aryan ancestry, even though his grandfather had not been Jewish, but it was a name that certain Jews had been given in the 1700s. Now, in fact, Heydrich's mother, Elizabeth, took religious education and active participation in church life very seriously. She was a proud Christian, and one wonders what lessons her son drew from this when he embarked on his murderous career. But in 1916, the Heydrich family are awaiting the publication of what was called the Music Lexicon, which is the most complete and widely used German encyclopedia of music at the time. And that summer it was supposed to appear with an entry on Bruno Heydrich's life. They opened the encyclopedia and they discovered an entry suggesting that Bruno was a Jewish composer. And in a Protestant city with latent anti-Semitism, this could spell the end of his career. So he sued the encyclopedia editors for libel. And the lawsuit in 1916 revealed that the original entry on Heydrich, without any sort of Jewish insinuation, had been altered by a former pupil of Heydrich who'd been expelled from the conservatory. And this was an act of revenge. Bruno won the court case, and the Jewish background was removed from the next edition, but the rumours didn't disappear. In fact, they increased after one of Reinhard's uncles married a Jewish woman from Hungary. And at school, Reinhard's schoolmates began to call him and his brother Heinz Izzy. Can you imagine? This is the most notorious head of the SS. And throughout the years of World War I, Heydrichs placed a great deal of importance on denying these rumours, but Jews sent their sons and daughters to Heydrich's conservatory, and in fact, Bruno rented out the cellar of the school as a storage space to a local Jewish salesman, which means they encountered Jews on a personal level. Now, Heydrich becomes a ranking member of the Nazi Party and the SS almost from the beginning. In 1941, when Germany invaded Soviet Eastern Europe, Heydrich oversaw the Einsatzgruppen's activities. They would carry out the Nazi plans by means of mass graves. And in January 1942, Heydrich ran the infamous Wannsee Conference to implement the final solution. He was also the Reichsprotector of Bohemia and Moravia, which means he ruled the Czech people, and he did so with brutality. He lived in Prague. On May 27, 1942, he was attacked by Czech resistance members in his open-topped car. He didn't die immediately. He is hospitalized with severe blood poisoning. And on the 2nd of June, Goebbels reflected on Heydrich's worsening condition. He writes in his diary, "The loss of Heydrich would be disastrous." And in fact, a similar view prevailed in Britain, and I quote, "If Heydrich should not survive the attempt on his life, or is invalided for some appreciable time, the loss for the Nazi regime would be very serious indeed. It can be safely said that next to Himmler, Heydrich is the soul of the terror machinery." But he died on the 4th of June, and I'm pleased to say that he died a very agonizing death. But there was one very unanticipated consequence. The day before his funeral, his brother Heinz is given Heydrich's papers, standard procedure, which means as well as his personal papers, the box contained information about the Nazis' plans for the final solution. Now, Heinz had supported Hitler and the Nazi government, but he had no idea that Hitler intended to systematically exterminate the Jewish people. These files had been in the safe in Gestapo headquarters, and they're given to his brother Heinz. He shuts himself away in his room with the papers, and the next morning his wife noticed that her husband had been burning documents. And in fact, years later, his son said, "I remember that my father, who was on leave for the front, could not be engaged in conversation. He seemed to be somewhere else mentally, like stone." And the information changed Heinz. Improbably and unbelievably, he began to look for a way to help Jews. Now, there's no point in sort of speaking out, so he used his position to help Jewish families escape. He was working with the newspaper Die Panzerfaust, which gave him access to paper and printing. And he's a well-established member of the party, the brother of a deceased high-ranking officer, so his activities aren't closely monitored. And he used the newspaper press to forge official-looking passports and travel permits. And he continues this secret work until November 1944. But then there is a state attorney's investigation at the newspaper offices, and he is terrified that he's been found out and what the repercussions will be for his wife and 5 children, so he committed suicide. He shot himself. Although subsequent historians have written that in fact the state attorney hadn't suspected anything and this was a routine investigation.
Wow. How was his actions found out in the end?
In other words, how do we know
what he did?
That he was actually saving Jews? First of all, we know of certain Jews in 1943 who escaped, I think, to neutral Sweden as a result, and also because he must have, to some degree, perhaps confided or at least hinted to his wife what he was doing, because she never spoke about it. She never even spoke about it to her own son.
Wow, 2 very different paths taken by 2 brothers. But it also proves that propaganda in itself doesn't change you completely. It's still one's choice to become a mass murderer or saviour.
Absolutely.
This excuse of following orders.
Yep. And perhaps we'll end with a brief look into SS Heydrich's wife, Lina Heydrich. She wouldn't allow anything to be said against her husband, and in 1962 she wrote to a Dutch historian on the subject of Heydrich's guilt, and she said, "Why is he so important today? Why so discussed? I ask you, is a warlord brutal because many people die under his command? Why is sadism and brutality read into those decisions which my husband dictated in the course of his duties, and which perhaps in his eyes were an unavoidable political necessity?" And in 1965, she told a reporter of the Dutch newspaper, the Die Nieuwe Dag, that her husband had not been anti-Jewish. He had nothing against the Jews, and he had nothing to do with the campaign of their extermination. And anyway, the European Jews were taken to the Urals in the Soviet Union. And she herself never stood trial for the mistreatment of her slave labourers who were working on her estate for the rest of the war after her husband's assassination. And she retained a fanatically positive view of Hitler. The Führer was a fantastic man. He was charming, courteous, and very intelligent. And in fact, to this day, in the neo-Nazi leagues, Heydrich, who was obviously never convicted because he was assassinated, this mass murderer remains the greatest. He is the ideal National Socialist.
We have a harder time wrapping our heads around the Nazi females. I mean, especially the Nazis who were in the camps, who are known sadists, and there's many famous ones. But even a wife, a mother, who is able to look past it, it's a bit harder to understand.
It's a mentality that sees the world in exactly the same way as it was portrayed in the late 30s, and that is there are two forces, what we spoke about last week. They are literally a plague on the world. The world is being helped by their removal. It's deep, it's an ideology, it's an absolute commitment, and it's not going to change because of numbers or because of trials or because you lose the war.
Wow. So like you said, two very different stories, one a Jew, one a non-Jew, but both stood up, and it shows the power of one person and what he's able to achieve. And it's incredible that we're bringing his achievements to light so many years after his passing, but also the fact that in his lifetime, he wasn't celebrated enough for his actions.
Right, and it has to be said that David Kranzler, the historian, Oliver Scholem, is mainly responsible, having brought this to light.
Thank you very much, Robert Hirsch. I urge the listeners to join the WhatsApp group, which the link will be in the description below. There will be many fascinating behind-the-scenes moments of the podcast, as well as being able to virtually join Robert Hirsch on his travels around the world. And we'll see you next week or in a couple of weeks for the Tisha B'Av episode.
Yes, it's a shame.